Hey everybody! Guess who passed their O.W.Ls and is well on their way to becoming a zoologist? My parents would be so proud. So let's get started with my April O.W.Ls wrap up. During the month of April, I read 12 books, which is definitely a record for me, but things are very different right now. I can say that I am keeping that high momentum up during May, which is pretty exciting for me. I'm going to go ahead and go through my reads. I'm going to start with my lowest rated and finish with my highest rated. So all of these but one were for my O.W.Ls, and I'll let you know which one was not for my O.W.Ls when I get to it. To be fair, also a lot of these were shorter books. A lot of my kids' books made it into the mix, so that did make it easier for me to get 12 books done. So let's get started. The lowest rated book on my list, I mentioned this in my vlog, was Remember Me by Treza Azzopardi. This is a book following a homeless woman. Her suitcase full of stuff was taken from her. The prose for this, it had a good writing style. That's about it. It just wasn't for me. This was the book that I chose that was outside of my usual genre, and there's a reason for that. Cons, the timeline on this was so disruptive that I could never fully get into the story. It kept going back and forth between present day and her childhood, and it was a lot of rambling thoughts that were harder to understand. So you'd kind of get into the feel of the story and get into the rhythm of the book, and then you'd be disrupted by some rambling thoughts that made it kind of pulled you out of that story. Another con is that her character just wasn't that intriguing. I never once felt like I was really attached to anybody in the story. There was like a half little second of a romance that I kind of got excited for and then quickly disappeared. So yeah, not my favorite book. I will probably be unhauling this. The next lowest book on my list, which is an even bigger disappointment, but I did like it a little bit more, Morty by Robert Rapino. So this book is about a colony of ants that kind of become sentient. They spend centuries building up an army underground, and one of their last steps is transforming land animals into just kind of these war machine. I thought it was going to be like a funny, action-packed, rowdy, rough kind of feel, and instead it was just a whole thing about the devastating aspects of war. Prose of this book, it was an intriguing story. If you go into it with the right mindset and kind of knowing that it is going to be a depressing book, it's probably very enjoyable. It has some action, and it has a lot of good characters. You just have to know what you're getting into. So cons, not what I expected at all. Did not live up to what I had built up in my head, which is, you know, probably my fault, but based on the synopsis on the back, I was kind of hoping for a fun adventure with this war cat, and it was not fun. It was all depressing. Book number 3. Now these are the ones that I enjoyed. They're my kind of 3 stars. They were middle of the road, so they weren't bad, but they weren't like my highest rating. So next on my list is Poor Unfortunate Souls by Serena Valentino. This was a good book, don't get me wrong. I really like this book. However, I started at book 3 in this series. I did not realize that you had to read the other books, which you don't have to, but the very first few chapters are confusing if you don't read the first little bit. Eventually it starts to make sense and it's not that big of a deal, but I do think it made it a little bit of a lower rating story for me. I would say prose, great villain story, very enjoyable characters, and it lines up with what you know about Ariel and the Little Mermaid. Cons, did not give me enough Ursula. It was half Ursula, half characters from previous stories, and I wanted all Ursula. So a little bit disappointed that it wasn't more focused on this, but I mean, look at that cover. That in and of itself is worthwhile. Next, I have a few smaller books that are just kind of middle of the road. There aren't really pros and cons to these. They're just one of those books that, like, okay, yeah. So, Genies Don't Ride Bicycles. I mean, what can you say about this? It's not going to be like a 5-star read for me, but nostalgia? Definitely a good book. If you're a kid, read these series. Who is J.K. Rowling? A nice little biography. Really good for kids if you know somebody who's just starting out and enjoying the Harry Potter series. I would definitely recommend this. Even I learned a few things. Also read How to Train Your Dragon. Good book. It surprisingly did not follow the movie very closely at all. I still really enjoyed it, but like very little of this is what you would see in the movie. And I like Toothless in the movie way better. They did not do Toothless justice in this book. But the story is really hilarious, and it has great illustration. I mean, beautiful. So definitely recommend reading. I don't think I'm going to read the rest of the books in this series. For maybe the first time in my life, I liked the movie better. My last two, like, middle-of-the-road books, I have Mr. Monday by Garth Nix. Garth Nix is one of my favorite authors, and this is one of his middle grade fantasies. It follows a boy who finds a key that leads him to kind of this different world, and that world is bleeding over into his world. I really like this series. I've read the first 4 in this series before, and I want to get the full way through. So the first time I read these books, I was probably more in the actual age range that would be recommended for this. I think as a middle grade, it is still lacking in a few places, especially now that I've read other things by this author, and in this genre that I think hold a little bit firmer than this one. Pros, great characters, and world building is really fun and enjoyable. Cons, I think things are not as well fleshed out as they could be. The magic system is a little bit like, oh, okay, we need this, we have it, and just seems very random. There aren't very many rules so far. It is still the first book. But I'm excited to see how this one ends and keep reading this because it is very enjoyable. Next on my list is one that I've done a review video for, and that is Wink Poppy Midnight by April Genevieve Tudlow. This is a story about a love triangle between 3 teenagers. It's very strange. The characters are bizarre, and I loved it, but I can see why people would not enjoy it at all. I think the ending was not quite what I wanted to be, and the characters aren't very believable, but if you're okay with setting that aside, it's a cute little read. Okay, now we're into my higher rated. These are my 4s and 5s. The first one on this list is Making Bombs for Hitler. And I have to give this book, like, kudos. This is a great introduction into World War II. This is something I would 100% put into my classroom and recommend to my kids, especially if they were interested in learning more about that time period. I was curious before how it kind of fell into the spectrum of World War II books. Did it go too easy? Did it go too far for kids? And I think this did a really, really, like, surprisingly good job of hitting its mark. For example, a lot of my students struggle with the concept of death on a larger scale. It doesn't quite fit into what they know of life so far. Some of them haven't even encountered death yet. And so it's hard for them to figure out what that means on a grand scale and why that is so significant. And I think this book does a good job. It doesn't really talk about gas chambers, but it does show several deaths, but they make sure that they are all important to the main character. I think it would make it easier for students to understand the significance of it. It also does a good job of portraying the unfairness of it on a smaller scale that students could understand as well. For example, in the concentration camp that they're in, they're given out soup, and the German and the Polish prisoners are given a better soup than the Ukrainian prisoners. And so it kind of shows just the little injustices, which I think is a great segue into learning about this. And it also does discuss how her friend is Jewish and how even she is scared that for her friend. They're both in the same situation, the same concentration camp, but her friend is clearly in more danger than she is. So it does a really good job of portraying a lot of hard concepts in a way that kids could understand. So kudos, high props to this book. Next on my list, I have Warcross by Marie Lu. This is probably the one on the list that I was most excited to read, and it held up to the hype. So this is about a girl who lives in a time where virtual reality is a big thing, and there are games that everybody plays called Warcross. It's like the Animal Crossing of its time. She is a hacker, and so she accidentally one day hacks her way into like a worldwide championship. The creator of the game actually decides to have her work for him as a spy because there's other things going on underneath the surface. So, pros of this book. Loved the story. Like, it was the perfect balance of romance and action. There was never really a slow point in my mind. I'm pretty easy to please, so this was right up my alley. It's definitely not an in-depth look at these kinds of things, but there was enough going on. I didn't want to put it down. I was really intrigued by the world that she was in, and I think it did a good job of bringing that world to life. I wouldn't say it's an in-depth world as far as world building goes, but it's just enough that you feel like you have a good handle on it and what's happening. Cons. This is a little bit of a spoiler. Not going to give too much away, but just spoiler alert. There is a character that I really loved, that I was rooting for, that by the end of the book you can no longer root for, and it broke my heart a little bit, and I am a little sad about that. Another con is that there isn't actually as much of the Warcross game as I would like to see. Like, the few times that it's in the book, it was super cool, and I wanted to know more, but sometimes they just, like, skipped over that. They're like, oh yeah, these two guys played and this person won, instead of, like, giving us the actual details. But overall, I think I gave this a 4 or a 5 out of 5. However, I am hesitant to read the next one because I read some reviews and it said the main character, which is like this really awesome girl who like does what needs to be done, kind of gets wishy-washy in the next one, and the romance is not necessarily going in the direction you expect, and there's even less Warcross. I don't know, I haven't read it, but I've been burned by sequels before, and I feel like this may be one where I just don't ever read the second one, and I just kind of enjoy the love that I had for the first one. Alright, my last two books are my highest rated this month. The first one was very surprising to me because I thought it would be good, did not realize how good, and that is A Tale Dark and Grim. This is by Adam Gidwitz, and so it is a Hansel and Gretel retelling, but it's a very vague retelling, to be honest. One thing I did not like about this is the beginning is very slow, but once you get into it, holy cow. It does not hold back from violence at all. You can see I've tabbed a few things there. It does not hold back from violence. It's very much like, I couldn't recommend this to my students because there's points where like they get a dragon drunk on wine, or Hansel goes and has to defeat the devils. So let me read this a little bit so you can see how grim it really gets. Its mouth opened wide and snapped down on the woman with a bow. She hadn't even moved to defend herself. There hadn't been time. Now half of her was gone. The dragon swiped at a man with an axe. He landed on his back, 10 feet away, without his internal organs. Definitely does not hold back, which I think is great. I think it would be hard to recommend for a kid, but I loved it. It was so grim. It held up to the grim part. Not only that, but the greatest thing was that it had these like beautiful moments of just understanding, like things I 100% felt as a kid and couldn't quite name or put my finger on or explain to someone about why I was feeling a certain way. But let me just read you a few little quotes, a few gems. It will happen to you, dear reader, at some point in your life. You will face a moment very much like the ones Hansel and Gretel are facing now. In this moment, you will look at your parents and realize that no matter what it sounds like they're saying, they are actually asking you for forgiveness. This is a very painful moment. You see, all your life you've been asking for forgiveness from them. So having them ask you for forgiveness probably sounds good, but when the moment comes, you will probably be in a lot of pain and you will probably not want to forgive them. What should you do? Like, it's just so, oh my gosh, there are so many great little quotes. Like, I definitely had that feeling before. I just, loved this book. You should all read it just because it's so relatable and just wonderful. I love it. I can't stop gushing about it. I've recommended it to everybody, so now I'm recommending it all to you. The highest rated book that I read in April is a reread for me, and it was the one book that was not on my O.W.Ls. I actually started it in March and managed to have time to finish it, and that is The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. Which, like, do I even need to say anything about this? It's legendary. It's Lord of the Rings, y'all. Like, there's no need to explain why this book is awesome. We all know it's awesome. It is a God among men. So, yeah, this was how I finished off my month, and it was probably the best way to finish off the month. Now I'm gonna go finish watching the movie. So, I hope you all had a good month. I am excited to keep you up to date on my TBR for May. I've so far read 5 of my books. I drew 10 in my TBR game. If you want to watch that video, the link is down below. But yeah, I drew 10, and I'm definitely going to be reading more because I've been putting off other things and cruising through books. I hope you all are doing well. Let me know what you're reading, and I will see you later. Bye.